Scope Creepers. Are you recording?
Yeah.
Welcome to the Brown Baggy Business Chat. So we're back, and for the first time ever, we are on Blab, which after much trial and error, we have gotten working. And I have today with me, as usual, Heather Steele.
Hello.
And Randy Skinner.
Hey, guys.
And we are going to be talking about scope creepers. So scope creep is a problem that... Creeper!
I couldn't help it.
Maybe you should play the Snoop Dogg song later.
Yeah.
So, scope creepers are people who... Scope creep is just a problem in general, especially in our industry, but in a lot of industries, where a client and you have agreed to something, you've set a scope of work, and then they want just a little bit more, and just a little bit more. And then suddenly you find that you've done a lot more work for them than you're getting paid for, and then you're agreed upon. So today we're going to talk about what it is, how it works, how to deal with it, safeguards to stop it from happening, etc. So does one of y'all want to start us off and give us a definition of scope creep and really like how it works across different types of businesses?
Or how it shouldn't work?
Yeah.
Randy, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah.
Since you asked what we're talking about.
I did, and now I know. Yeah, so the basic, I think, description of scope creep would be that you have a project, you've outlined kind of all the elements that are going to fall into it, whether it be a website that you're designing, or maybe you have a carpet cleaning business and you're going to go in and clean this 4-bedroom home, or whatever service that you provide, you've outlined what you're going to give the client or your customer. And that individual, that shameful scope creeper, is just constantly kind of coming in and maybe adding on, well, hey, I wanted to add this function, or I'd really like to have this room clean. I'm obviously kind of being a little bit of an exaggerator on that one, but just kind of adding components that maybe aren't in your original project outline or project scope. And they're creeping on what you kind of what you had agreed upon from the beginning of what your project would be. So that's kind of the basic outline of scope creep. People can, there's a lot of different ways that it can happen. What would you add to that, Heather?
I think that, scope creep comes back to, it's really on the service provider, right? Like it's our job to prevent it, to put things in place to make sure it's not going to happen, and to stop it in its tracks when it does start to. Unfortunately, I think the only way to get really good at stopping scope creep is to have to suffer through it a few times and then learn from those bad lessons. So, I think you described it perfectly. I think anyone in a service-based business has probably experienced it. And if they haven't, then they're either a liar or like the luckiest person in the world.
Yeah.
All right. So we've already talked a little bit about it, but why is it such a problem? Like what can it do beyond just, I've spent more time on this than I meant to?
Well, I think like from being the provider, it's a problem because you really can lose money. But I think that it also makes you look like you kind of aren't on top of things. I mean, if you've done your job right and you've outlined the scope of your project, everything that's going to go into it, then you really have communicated those expectations up front. And if you haven't, then you're kind of working backwards. And so it makes you as the service provider look like you don't really have it all together. I mean, I think that's my personal opinion of it. I mean, you can really anticipate a lot of things as you go along, and you'll get better at it as you go along. But that's kind of the risk. It's money, and it's how you look.
Uh-oh.
We can still hear you.
There we go.
Yeah,
it's working now.
It looked like y'all were frozen, but I think maybe I was frozen. I don't know.
No, I was really still.
Yeah. I gave you some props for that one.
So another issue with allowing scope creep to happen is it can create a lot of frustration for the client, because they at a certain point lose sight and forget about what it is that they actually purchased from you in the first place. And what's going to happen is you're going to let a few things kind of come into the project. You're going to say, okay, that'll slide. We'll go ahead and do those things and not charge extra for them. And then at some point, you're going to have to start saying no. And that's when people are going to get frustrated. They're going to be angry because they feel like they're not getting enough value from what they've paid for, when really you've already given them more than you should have to begin with. So one thing that we do, and I may be getting ahead here, but when people want to add something to a project, you don't have to say no. You can just say, okay, let me send you a change of work order for that, or let me send you pricing on what that would be, and we'll sign a new agreement. So you can stop that frustration before it even begins by making sure they know during the sales process that this is what's covered and everything else will be additional, and then sticking to that, not letting even the smallest thing slide, because then you're just going down the road for major frustration.
So it's kind of like setting boundaries and saying, and letting the client know this is exactly what, what's okay and what's not okay from the beginning.
Yes, definitely.
Well, and going back to kind of what you just said, Heather, it's part of our sales process. I mean, really one of our steps is, I don't know what our technical term would be. It could be like a fact finder. It could be where we actually outline the scope. Like we call it a scope call. It's probably kind of different to each business or each industry, what their target line would be, but like a needs analysis. And at that point, you've already identified what project you're going to do, and you're kind of diving in with your client saying, what are all the bells and whistles that we want? So if you've done your job right on the front end from the sales cycle, then you've already done all of the research as far as what should be in that project. And you've already had that conversation of, well, hey, yeah, these 10 things, we can totally cover that with this budget and this project. And these 5 are great, but they're going to have to be another project and may have to wait. They're not going to be in this current project. So, I mean, if we've done our job right and we've done the sales cycle right, we already have all that information. It's just, are we presenting it to the client in the right way?
Mm-hmm. And that's a really great point, that the scope of work shouldn't just be something you talk about. Like, it should be a document.
Yeah.
With very detailed bullets of what's included. And that should be signed before you ever take $1 from the client.
Yeah.
Unless you're charging to create the scope of work, which is another topic.
All right. So do you think there are underlying reasons for scope creeping? I mean, is it just certain personality types who are these scope creepers? Like what is it? Can you tell right away that, this guy's going to be a scope creeper, that this lady's going to be a scope creeper, or what's that like?
I think, yeah, a lot of times you kind of have that intuition, especially after you've worked in the industry for a while and you kind of get to know different customer types. There's definitely times when you're like, okay, we're going to need to, like, every week look at the scope of work and remind them what they've paid for and what they haven't. But there's also surprises. And that's where, as soon as you slip and you decide, these people get it, they know what's included, I'm just going to be very general in their agreement, and I'm not going to worry about all that documentation because they're cool. They will ask for more.
Yeah. And
then you'll end up in that frustration cycle.
Okay. So
anything to add to that, Randy?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with it. And, I think there are those people that you can kind of identify it and, the scope creep is coming on, but I think too, sometimes people don't mean to do it, at least for us, we're coming in, we're solving a problem, we're helping them create efficiencies, and people get excited and they want to do more. And so that's an element that can happen. It's like, oh, what about this? What about this? Because a lot of times if you're solving a problem, it makes sense that you've kind of created more space for that person to get more creative, be able to think about other marketing opportunities, at least for us. And so I think that sometimes it's just human nature, and that if we do our job well enough, it kind of would happen because they get excited and they want to do more. And I think people don't realize how much can go into a certain project. You're like, oh, I just want to move this trinket to the left-hand side. Well, I mean, that's going to take us 4 hours if you want it to have glitter come out of it, whatever it is.
A common web design.
Can you tell I'm not the developer?
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so when you have the scope creep just usually happen like during a project, or can people like can it be longer term than that? Like people who are like, oh, you did this website for me 3 months ago and I need you to do this now. Or 3 years from now.
There is retroactive scope creep.
Retro scope creeping.
Yes. So those kinds of inquiries, I think, again, you have to be addressing on the front end. And now I'm thinking about like what's in our agreement. We may need to revisit that after this session. But you have to think on the front end of how long am I supporting this for? Whether it be, obviously in our world, it's going to be a website or some sort of branding piece or something like that. But whatever you're creating or delivering to the customer, need to have kind of a warranty period. And again, a detailed list of what's included in that so that the customer knows on the front end what to expect, what they can come back to you for, what they're going to have to pay extra for, and what they've already paid coverage for.
So are there other measures that you can take to prevent scope creep? I know we've talked a little bit about writing some stuff down, but do you ever have to just have like a come to Jesus and say, look, we got to talk?
Yeah, definitely. And that usually happens after you've let it go too far.
Okay.
And then you have to like rein it back in.
So how would what are other preventative measures that could be taken?
I think a really basic one, and we kind of touched on this, but one of the challenges I run into personally when I'm working with clients is that a lot of times when I'm working with people, I love working with them. That's why they're one of my clients. And so it can be really hard to tell someone no, especially when the value of something is much more than maybe the time. And, we do a lot of our pricing on value of things. So yeah, it would be really easy for me just to go in and create your entire social media profile. But I mean, I really can't do that. And we don't do social media, but it's kind of a silly example. But one of the most basic things you can do is in your agreement, in everything that you're sending to them, make it big and bold. And this is something that we've recently done, is adding in statements that are super clear that say, hey, if this falls outside the scope of these specific bulleted project outlines, then it would be a new project. And, we have it at the top of every agreement. We have it in the actual agreement, like in our bulleted line items. And it's just very clear, super upfront. And that way you have the conversation before it even starts happening, so that when it does start happening, you can be like, well, you remember that agreement? You remember that conversation we had at the beginning? I just can't do it. Or you send Heather in and you make her be the bad guy. So all of you need a Heather.
That's funny.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So, another thing that this isn't actually my idea, but a good friend of mine, Nathan Porter, shared this idea that a big problem that they have with their scope creep is that people go beyond the date range that they've set in the original agreement. And so they actually have a termination of contract that they put into their agreement. So if someone is taking too long to respond and the project is just dragging and dragging and dragging, part of their scope of work is keeping that into a defined date range so that they can, once they've gone past that, say, okay, peace. It was great, but we're done. Like,
thank you.
Contract over. So that's another great way to keep people kind of inside of that box.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, do you ever have I'm trying to think of different types of scope creepers. So we talked about our friends, right? Who they're just like excited and into it. Do you ever get someone who it's like they're just they know they shouldn't be doing this, but they're trying to get as much as they can out of you?
I would like to think we've gotten really good at spotting those types of people and not doing work with them at all to begin with. In the beginning, yeah. Definitely. There was people that were like that would try to take advantage and use every single ounce of your energy and suck your soul completely dry. But fortunately, we've lived and learned through those lessons. And now when we see those types of people, we run away. So the best way to avoid that type of scope creeper is no matter how desperate you are to get the next project, if you feel like this is going to be rough, and this person is going to drive me insane with trying to add more and more into the project, like trust that intuition and walk away from it.
Great. And I just want to remind, we got a few viewers. So if you guys have any questions, please type them in so we can answer. So does scope creep, I mean, we've talked a little bit about how it hurts us, right, as a business, but is it detrimental to them as well?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that it can be harmful to the relationship that you formed with the client, which is just harmful to both parties.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think too, when sometimes I feel like scope creep can happen because we have so many ideas kind of coming out of the woodworks and there's not necessarily like a strategy in place for some of those ideas. And so if they're throwing different things at you or trying to add on new things, I think that the client sometimes may not be necessarily looking at all of the components that could go into that and might be missing where their time or their efforts would be better spent. For example, you know, if we want to add 5 different features onto the website because, you know, they just have this great idea, well, really, we should talk about what those are, do a little bit of investigation on, you know, what we're wanting to do. Is that in line with our target audience? And kind of do that fact-finding, that needs analysis process before we actually go in and start implementing a project. And so scope creeping kind of prevents that from being a part of the process. I kind of was wordy on that. Hopefully it made sense.
No, that's okay. That made perfect sense. So, what do you do with the scope creeper when it's over? Like when the project's over and we're done, and you know that they might want to do more work with you, like, and you'd be like, all right, we've made it through, we figured it out, we got rid that there was creep, but not too much creep. What do you do in the future? Can you come back with someone you've already worked with and say, okay, now we need to do this a little bit differently, even though they might have other expectations based on the previous work?
I say yes. I mean, the best thing you can do is just be honest and say, hey, I'm glad we got this project done, but I got to tell you, that was bad for me. Like, I wanted you to be so super happy that I did way more work than I should have for the fee. And if we do any more work together, I'm going to have to be more strict on what's included and not adding anything to that without increasing the fee.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
If somebody doesn't like it, let them go.
Well, and I think too, no matter what type of industry you're in as a business owner, you've probably experienced that yourself. And so when someone comes to you and is like, hey, you know what, this hurt my bottom line. Like, I can't do this again. Sorry, you know, they're going to understand that. And if they don't, then they probably ain't the person you want to work with anyway. So
that's true.
And as Snoop says, drop them like it's hot. If you weren't here at the beginning, I did reference that song. So
I'm really proud of you for that.
I think if you could just repeat that,
yes.
That would make everyone super happy.
Maybe at the very end, maybe when we're closing out.
So, is there such a thing as a project that's big enough that you will allow scope creep? What, you know, there's nothing you can do about it. Like, is there such thing as being like, this is my bread and butter, this client, without this client, I'm kind of SOL. So, you know, they're not going to listen to me when I say this isn't in scope, and I just have to figure a way around this.
First of all, I think that's a lie that we tell ourselves, that a client is so big that, you know, I need them. I think that is a really bad position to be in as a small business owner or a business owner, because if you have so many eggs in one basket that you are dependent upon that client, then you wouldn't invest all of your money in just one stock and say, cross my fingers, hope it works. So, I mean,
come on, Blockbuster.
Come on, Radio Shack. But I think my personal opinion is we've kind of learned to build that in. So we've learned to, okay, we got a little bit of a scope creeper over here, and we want to be able to do a little bit of that. And so we kind of add that into our proposal somewhere. It's like, hey, we're going to do these things. We know that they're going to want these extra custom hours, so we're going to add that in there. And so I think that if you know your client and you've done the due diligence and building that rapport, getting to know their business, and knowing their goals and their objectives, you can really kind of handle that on the front end and build that into your proposal. There's always going to be instances where it just happens. And so I think that that's where you kind of already have to have those checks and balances in place. And I don't know, Heather, I'll turn that over to you. I mean, you're the CEO of our company, and the decision really comes down to you. Mm-hmm. So how do you handle that?
I think definitely baking some extra time into the proposal is one way to address it. But then you still have that problem of they're going to ask for something and you're going to say yes, and then you're going to say yes again, and then eventually you're going to have to say no. Mm-hmm. So you still have to be setting that expectation of, you know, we've added in this extra set of X number of hours if you do your pricing that way, or there just needs to be some way to clearly communicate to the client that I can't say yes to everything. There has to be a way for them to see, like, this is the value I've added to the project without charging you additional, and this is where it's going to cut off.
So what can this one's a little off the top of my head. What can an employee do when a client tries to scope creep, and maybe you're used to push, you know, everything's figured out by your boss or whatever, or by a salesperson, and suddenly they start scope creeping with you? Like, how do you handle that as a smaller employee?
That's a good question. Maybe we should ask Frank, because I think I do that to him all the time.
Can we phone a friend? I think that's a really good question. And, you know, I think that it comes down to being very upfront with where your roles are and your own boundaries. And honestly, I feel like in a healthy work environment, you really shouldn't ever feel like you're left out on your own. Like, I feel like if you run into that you should be like, hey, you know what, let me check into that. And as an employee, you know, you have the responsibility first to your business, then to your clients. And so, you know, you have to figure out if there's a questionable, am I taking too much time away from this? Is this going to impact the bottom line for our company? Then I think you have to go to maybe a peer that has experienced something similar and kind of get their feedback, or even go to your boss, you know, talk to them, ask them for their feedback. They've been in our shoes, you know, they know what it's like. And so if you're not comfortable kind of shutting it down, then I think it's okay to kind of ask for help, and just, you don't have to go it alone. I mean, the client's not respecting your boundaries and your time. I mean, that's just kind of the end game of it. And they may not realize that. I'm going to ask you, Adam. Yeah. Yes. Like, what, Adam?
Because I think, was your question more like if internal pressure is causing you to push something outside of the scope, not necessarily like the client? So somebody else internally is making the decision of, we'll go ahead and do this. Yeah. We'll go ahead and do this. And, you know, like, we're edging into this is no longer profitable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think definitely being able to have a clear, open kind of environment is really important to keeping that down. It's kind of a luxury that not everyone's going to have.
Yeah.
So that is a really tough one. I think you just have to state that this is the amount of time I'm spending. I know that this is going to affect our margins, and maybe have that even documented in some sort of way, like in an email or something, so that you're not just out there on your own making these or appearing to make decisions that are going to affect the profitability of a project.
Right.
Make sure it's well documented that you have passed this up the chain, that accepting this piece of scope into the project is going to cause me to take more time than I should. Kind of CYA, have it in an email or something that's documented, so that if you are in a more difficult work environment, you at least have that there, where you've done your job, you've said this is going to cause an issue, you've documented it, and then there's really only so much you can do if you're not the decision maker.
Yeah. And I think to what you were talking about, Randy, I think there is something that, you know, if an employee finds that the client is pushing them to do something that, you know, that they and your boss have not agreed upon, I think it's really actually a much better position, because all I have to say is, you know, I can't add anything until I talk to my boss.
Yeah.
So I let me pass that up the line. I'll be sure to talk to them about that. but I can't promise anything because I don't have that authority. So it's really easy, I think, to pass that off.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Just to add to what you were saying about being internally scope being added. I mean, if I'm thinking of it from like our perspective, right? Like here at Blue Steel Solutions, we all kind of have our own areas of expertise. And like if we were talking about adding in content, I feel like I would have an expectation that you as the expert would be the one telling me, you know, more than even Heather, more than Frank, more than Cassie. Or vice versa, you know, if it's like design, Cassie needs to be like, hey, that's going to be 10 more hours, not the hour that you're saying, Randy.
Right.
So I think that it's super important to create that atmosphere internally so that you can do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. Any last thoughts on scope creepers?
Avoid it. Document everything. Remind your client often of what's in scope and what's not.
Yeah.
Randy? Just say no.
Just say no to scope creep.
Yeah.
Are you going to take us out with your song?
Sure.
Do it, Randy.
Scope.
I'm gonna
name that song.
I'm gonna call Snoop Dogg and let him know that he's got his new person for his next album. You're ready to go.
Well, good chatting with y'all. I'll see you in the conference room.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Bye.